Hello, hello, hello. You know what day it is? It's Data Day. Oh my gosh, I am very excited to tell you about the findings from the big Glucomannan experiment. First of all, if you don't know what I'm talking about, there's a whole video about the methods that I'm using. But long story short, I did a bunch of stool tests, and then I did 2 weeks of glucomannan, a prebiotic, and I did more stool tests to see where my microbiome went in that 2 week time frame. Then I did a washout period, meaning that I took no prebiotics whatsoever. And then I did more stool tests to see what my microbiome looked like on the other side of the washout period. Now, symptomatically, I will tell you, I freaking loved glucomannan. It was awesome. Many of you guys know from either this channel or listening to my podcast that when I had IBS and what I hypothesized was SIBO back in the day, I had diarrhea dominant IBS, lots and lots of bloating, lots of abdominal distension, and losing tolerance to a lot of foods. Nowadays, like since I've had my daughter and into my 30s, if my gut does get perturbed, I tend to gravitate more towards constipation, if anything. I have found that sleep and stress play huge roles in that for me, as well as physical activity or inactivity. But as a baseline, like I tend to be just a little bit more towards the constipated end than I would prefer. And if I travel or do something and my gut gets mad, it tends to be more of the constipation flavor than anything else in these days. Glucomannan was fantastic though. I had the most perfect, pristine Bristol stool chart poops, the smooth sausage, the smooth snake, the thing that everybody talks about and hypes up. It was freaking great. And now I feel like a chucklehead because I really want to go back on glucomannan, but I can't, or I won't, because I told all of you that I was going to see this through to the end, and it's basically going to be until the end of the year. So mark my words, in 2023, Mama's going back on some glucomannan. But in the meantime, let's talk a little bit about my findings. Hold on, let me get my head bubble here. All right. Quick 30-second rundown of statistics. Let me just say though, statistics and mathematics in general are not my passion in life. It's a necessary part of science. I get that, but I don't get super jazzed thinking about math and statistics, and I wouldn't say I'm exceptionally gifted with either of these. I actually phoned a friend and I talked to a friend who's a statistician to make sure that I was telling you guys accurate information and interpreting this correctly. But real quick, easy breezy overview. Remember the bell curve analysis, which I have so beautifully drawn for you here. Remember that the red line down the middle is the 50th percentile, the mean. And then on either side of that, we've got the green lines, and that's going to comprise the bulk of the data points, right? Between those two green lines, that's one standard deviation out from the mean, and that's most of the data, like 68%. Then if you go out one more bracket to the blue lines, that's the second standard deviation. And now you can see practically all of the data points are going to be between those two lines, right? It's something like 96% of the bell curve data points are going to be between the two blue lines. So for the purposes of this conversation, the way that I chose to wrap my head around the numbers and the statistics for you was I calculated the two standard deviation span for you guys. And then I'm using that to judge whether or not the data, the numbers shift that we're seeing is statistically significant. Because, and I'll show you to start off, because what happens is, and here I'll just come over here for an example. So if we look at some of these data points, so here we're looking at different days that I did each intervention. So all of the information in red here is all my baseline average from 4 samples. But if you look, like Proteobacteria, the first one we're going to talk about, Proteobacteria doing nothing different, just day to day, taking some samples, getting a baseline for you guys. My Proteobacteria went from 1.8 to 2.1 to 3.0 basically to 2.9. So that's a bit of fluctuation, right? So if we threw in another number here, say like 1.5, would that really be that atypical considering all of the noise in the data. Similarly, if we come over here to another page of the spreadsheet, if we look 0.14, 0.19, 0.40, 0.39, if we threw in another data point here that was like 0.200, that would fit in pretty well with the amount of normal fluctuation and normal noise just on a day-to-day looking at my stool samples, right? So that's where we need to look at something like the standard deviation, or in this case, the second standard deviation mark, to really get a sense of, all right, is this like atypical for what we would normally see? Is this actually something we're going to attribute to the glucomannan? So that is how I'm at least choosing to deem whether or not something is statistically significant or not. So without further ado, the way that I've organized these charts in this case, we've got the blue is the baseline and the intervention, and then the purple is intervention and then the washout. So we could compare both separately. All of these, so baseline, glucomannan, and washout, those are all the averages from multiple samples that I did. Again, if you want to watch the whole video about the experimental design, go ahead and nerd out on that if you want. But if we look here, for example, Proteobacteria, these are the bad hombres of the microbiome. If we're going to label any group of bacteria as such, it would be Proteobacteria. So this includes members like E. coli, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, Citrobacter, Shigella, Campylobacter, like all of the nasty nasties that you've heard horror stories about, they probably belong to this phylum. Side note, by the way, I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail on each of these bacteria types. We're going to go over like real high level stuff here. If you guys want me to do a really deep dive series of videos about like each of the phyla, each of the genuses, some of the key known species, let me know and I could do that. I'm just not really sure if that's something you would want to do versus just going on Google or PubMed yourself. Just let me know. I would like to make it, but this channel is not about what I want to do. It's about what you would benefit the most from and what you want to learn. That being said, so Proteobacteria, bad guys, oversimplification, but whatever. Normal is probably anything below like 3-4%, give or take. So mine were fine. And if you look, so we go from a baseline of 2.4 down to 1.36 with the glucomannan, which is pretty great. It was pretty close to being statistically significant, so we're going to call it a win. And then similarly, on the other side, we go from 1.36 up to 1.8 after the washout period. So not only did we get a decrease in this bad guy, or these bad guys, with the intervention, but then it did climb back up a bit after the fact. And that's a good stopping point for me to just mention, by the way. The reason why I chose to do 2-week intervention periods for all of these is I wanted to give it enough time and a good enough dose that I could actually change something. And most research indicates that the microbiome starts to change within about 2 days of changing your diet or taking a prebiotic. So I felt like 2 weeks was definitely long enough. We were going to feed what we wanted to feed, inhibit what we wanted to inhibit. But also I didn't want to do longer than that because I didn't want to permanently change my microbiome in a way that it would have been hard to see changes from the washout period. So for what it's worth, that was some of the method, method behind the madness behind the method. Anyway, and I took half a teaspoon of powdered glucomannan twice a day. So it ended up being about 2 grams twice a day. It was the dose that I was on for the 2 weeks. So going back to the nerdy data. Okay, genus. So we went from phyla, which are these really big, all-encompassing groups of bacteria, lots and lots and lots of different bacteria in one phylum. We're getting a little bit smaller now at the genus level, but the genuses are still pretty big. So if you think about like Lactobacillus as an example, we could have Lactobacillus acidophilus, Lactobacillus reuteri, Lactobacillus plantarum. There are many individual species within this genus, and similarly with any of the others, but we're getting a little bit more specific and granular now at the genus level. So you can see, for example, that my Prevotella and Bacteroides didn't really shift a whole ton. Fun fact, it's actually pretty atypical that you would have both of these in your microbiome. I'm one of the weirdos of the world. Normally, they compete for each other, or they crowd each other out typically and inhibit the other one. So I'm kind of an oddball that I have both Prevotella and Bacteroides. I don't think I've seen any others like mine in that regard, interestingly enough. But if we look, Bifidobacteria was really weird. That's why I highlighted it here. Bifido went from 2.8 or 0.28 to 0.05, which was close to being statistically significant. So the temptation is to go, ooh, cringe. This stuff inhibited my Bifido. That's not good. But then if you look, this is very confusing. Then I went from 0.05 up to 3.1. That's a huge jump. And to be honest, like, I've done a lot of stool tests on myself over the years. I have never seen my Bifido that high. Now here's the thing. I don't know why it's that high. I don't know if it's a delayed reaction to the glucomannan, but like 2 whole weeks later seems like a really long time. I don't know. The other thing that I thought maybe it could be was that I had some red wine shortly before doing the sampling. But then I went back and looked, and actually the red wine was like a full week prior. And the 3 samples in the washout period, my Bifido just keep getting higher and higher over the 3 days. I have no idea what was going on there. I really don't. So I don't know if I'm fully believing that this is the glucomannan. In truth, I might actually repeat the Glucomannan experiment like later on, maybe early 2023, when I start taking it just because I like it. And outside of this experiment, that might be the last video that I do, is revisiting glucomannan and my Bifido. But I'm still very surprised and very perplexed by that number. I have no idea what happened. Lactobacilli, the other famous probiotic genus, went from 0.56 basically to 0.1. So that's a pretty significant decrease. It's not statistically significant by the criteria we're using for this video, but it did go down a fair whack. And then if you look, it went from 0.1 up to 0.4. So it bounced right back to basically the baseline. Now this is weird and this is surprising, because honestly, the one thing that gets talked about, like in the stool study Facebook groups and, you know, the probiotic advisor, Jason Haverlack, his classes, the one thing that keeps coming up for glucomannan is that it feeds lactobacilli. At least for me, this N equals 1, that was not true. Now, again, remember, Lactobacillus is still a big genus. So it could be that my specific Lactobacilli species did not like glucomannan, but like maybe Lactobacillus acidophilus would like it just fine. I don't know. But that was surprising, and it was the opposite of what I thought would be true. Continuing on, we had a couple of patterns that I'll just graze over for you. Out of the butyrate producers that I've outlined here, you can see that Anaerostipes went down and then recovered in the washout period. Eubacterium went down and then recovered somewhat during the washout period. Rosberia went down and then recovered after the washout period. So those 3 appeared to have gone down with the glucomannan supplementation. But if you look here, some of the other butyrate producers went up. So we've got Coprococcus went up a fair amount, and then it basically normalized after the washout period. Ruminococcus doubled and then went back down after the washout period. And the one that I can't pronounce, Subdoligranulum, sure. That one went up quite a bit, and then again, pretty much normalized after the washout period, or it came a bit closer to its normal. So with the butyrate producers, we've got a mixed bag of like some going up, some going down. Interestingly, there appears to be a cross-feeding relationship between Rosberia, Anaerostipes, and Bifidobacterium. So it could be that one of them was kind of leading the way and then it was affecting the other 2. And that's 2 side notes that I want to pause here on. A, remember that there are cross-feeding relationships in the microbiome, and they're really, really important, and we don't understand a heck of a lot about them. So it's basically like bacteria A produces compound A, and then say you're a bacteria. Then bacteria B eats compound A and makes product B, and then another bacteria could come along and gobble up product B, and it's this whole, you know, circle of life kumbaya moment. But that being said, if you want to do a video on that, again, let me know. Again, this channel is not about what I want to make. It's about what you guys want to learn from me and what you would benefit the most from. I feel like cross-feeding relationships is really high-level super nerd stuff, so I don't think it's going to be as helpful for all of you. But if enough people are like, oh my God, yes, lady, we want to learn about cross-feeding relationships, I could do a video on that. Just know that they exist. The other thing I want to pause here and tell you while I have you off screen, remember, this is an N equals 1. Nikki equals 1. So this was my microbiome. What happened with my microbiome may or may not happen with yours, particularly when we're looking at like the genus level data, for example. Remember that we are all different. There are complexities and intricacies in our microbiome that we don't understand yet. That being said, and I'm going to remind you, I pooped like a stinking champion the entire time I was taking Glucomannan. I will confess to you, being as honest and non-biased as humanly possible in this experiment, it did look like my method of Brevibacter went up, which was very surprising to me. Again, this could be just me. It could be that that's just a weird fluky thing for my body. But if you look, method of Brevibacter went from 0.04 to 0.13, and then it went back down closer to the baseline after the fact. And both of those seem to be statistically significant. I'm fascinated by it. I'm not super worried about it. What I would say, because again, like I know, before you run away, like don't, for the love of God, don't go on the forums and say, oh my God, Glucomannan is terrible for methane SIBO. Everybody stop taking Glucomannan. Like, don't do that. What I would encourage you to do is if you are constipated and you have high methane levels, either from a SIBO breath test or a stool test like this, if your methane appears to be high and you're constipated, you could still try Glucomannan. Again, I pooped phenomenally well, even though my methane producers went up a little bit. However, if you take Glucomannan and your constipation gets worse, now you know that it's a possibility that maybe this will happen, and you can have your wits about you and you can discontinue it. The nice thing is Glucomannan is dirt cheap and it's really easy to use. So it's almost no harm, no foul if you want to give it a go. But I don't want people to take these videos out of context and blow them out of proportion and run to the forums and say, oh my God, Glucomannan is terrible for methane. We don't know. This was what happened in my microbiome. It did not produce any constipation. Actually, it alleviated constipation for me personally. Just listen to your body and see what happens. And honestly, like that's kind of the irony of all the stuff that we're talking about is I would still encourage you to listen to your body. Right? Like you don't need to watch any of this video in a weird way. Just try it and see how you feel. If you feel great, keep taking it. If you feel like crap, discontinue it. Like you almost don't need to hear this level of nerd data from me, but for what it's worth, don't panic about the methane. Similarly, I will share my allostipes went up. So I went from 2.4 to 4.5 and then back down to 2.8 after the fact. Both of those changes appear to be statistically significant. Now, allostipes is a bile consumer. I doubt very highly that I was producing a lot of extra bile and feeding allostipes. I think probably what happened is that there's some sort of cross-feeding relationship that I'm not aware of. For example, like maybe Ruminococcus and allostipes have a relationship and they go up and down together. Maybe Coprococcus and allostipes go up and down together, kind of like what I had mentioned with Rosberia Intestinalis and Bifidobacterium. That's my hypothesis that I think probably happened. I don't really think I was feeding allostipes with this because again, it's a bile consumer. I think that there was probably some sort of cross-feeding relationship. Okay, and then last page. Ooh, this is nerdy stuff, right? Last page, Rosberia Intestinalis. So remember, we talked about Rosberia, the bigger genus, and now we're talking about one named member of that genus. Rosberia Intestinalis went down a pretty fair whack with the glucomannan, and then it did look like it basically recovered after the fact. And Eubacterium rectale went down, that looks like a lot, going from 4.5 down to 2.0 seems like a huge difference. But if you look, it wasn't for me. And I'll show you to kind of pause here. If we look at Eubacterium rectale, from my baseline data, I went from, again, doing nothing different, just day-to-day sampling, I went from 8.46 to 4.4 to 2.05 to 3.21. So if there's that big of a span, just from 4 random days of sampling, doing nothing different, then really the difference here that we're seeing of about 2.5 is not super noteworthy. It feels like it should be, but it really was not for my data. But again, if you look, it did recover after the fact and rebounded pretty close to where it had been, and that second number was statistically significant. So for what it's worth, Rosberia intestinalis and Eubacterium rectale both seem to go down during the intervention and then recover and go back up after the fact. And then last but not least, highlighted in another color, Acromancia, the favorite child of the microbiome in the last 10 years, right? That and Bifido. And you can see this one was a little atypical. My Acromancia at baseline was 2.4. It went up to 3.95 with the intervention, and it's tempting to say, ooh, okay, rock solid. But then if you look, it continued to go up. It went from 3.95 to 4.5. What the heck? Like, this is another pattern, kind of like the Bifido, where I'm a bit perplexed, to be honest with you. I don't know what to make of that entirely. I don't know if I'm going to attribute that to a delayed response to the glucomannan, or if I think that I was doing something different after the fact. I really don't know. So I think I'm going to have to repeat this experiment. And when I go back to taking glucomannan just for shits and giggles because I like it, I'll probably do a follow-up video, but I'll supplement with it for like a month or two before I do the sampling again. And I'll give you and I'll probably do more data points. I'll probably do like 5 and 5 or something. And that way we have a little bit more clear data. But again, keeping in mind, for the 800th time I'm going to tell you in this video, this is all at n equals 1. Nikki equals 1. This was my microbiome, my cross-feeding relationships, my deficiency in a lot of stuff because I've had a lifetime of antibiotics. Overall, I think that this was really positive. Again, my subjective experience with glucomannan was amazing. I loved it so much, and I want to go back on it ASAP. To summarize the microbiome findings from this experiment, it looks like glucomannan inhibits Proteobacteria, which is great. That doesn't surprise me though, because feeding the good bacteria with prebiotics almost always is going to decrease Proteobacteria. So yay for confirming what I suspected all along. The short chain fatty acid and butyrate producers, some of them went up, some of them went down. So depending on the nature of what you're working on, you may benefit from it from that standpoint, or maybe not. So things like Coprococcus, Ruminococcus, and the sublingual, the one I can't pronounce, those all went up, pretty noteworthy. But then the Rosberia and Eubacterium genuses and Anaerostipes went down. So maybe a little bit of a frowny face there. I don't really know what to make of the Bifido, Lacto, and Acromancia. Those patterns all kind of perplex me a bit, but I'm fascinated by them nonetheless. And then last but not least, don't go running and screaming for the hills quite yet, but maybe, just maybe, glucomannan can slightly raise methane-producing organisms in people who have methane dominance. Again, if you took this as a constipation supplement and your constipation got worse, then maybe we could deduce that it increased your methane. But again, I tend to be a little bit constipated at baseline, and I felt fantastic, and I was pooping like a champion with the stuff, so don't take this completely out of context. I don't think it's going to cause methane dominance and constipation in everybody. But that was the first very long video. I have no concept of how long this one ended up being, but I hope that you guys gleaned something from it. Again, it's an n equals 1, I know that, but I think it's at least worth thinking about and looking into this sort of stuff. And honestly, I would love to repeat the experiment with a couple of volunteers in 2023. If I do that, I might just do like a little bit of a GoFundMe or a Kickstarter just to get the funds together, so I'm not shelling out tens of thousands of dollars for all of these poop tests. But that is something I kind of dream of doing, is getting more data points and repeating these experiments in the future. But for right now, you are left with me and my microbiome, because I volunteered myself for science. The next one is going to be PHGG, which I'm deeply curious about because it is such a huge, commonly used prebiotic in the SIBO world. I'm very interested to hear about PHGG and see what it did to my microbiome. I'm actually mailing off the last of the kits today. So give or take, it'll be about a month and a half before I get the data back in and I can interpret that. But I am very intrigued to see what happens with PHGG. Yeah, I'm chomping at the bit to find out what that one does with my microbiome. So until next time, guys, I have, of course, other videos on this channel coming out. So these microbiome stool test sample videos are going to be kind of just sporadic as I get the data back in throughout the year. But you can expect about one video each month or so for the remainder of the year. So until next time, I will see you guys for the big microbiome experiment of 2022. Toodaloo! Hey guys, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe, ring the bell, click the like button, and leave a comment down below with the videos that you would like to see me do next. Doing all of those really helps support the channel and support my efforts in making as many videos as possible for you guys. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.